Okay, so we're now going to focus on building an example application. And this example application is basically going to allow us to count down from a specific number to another number. Now this might seem very basic, but there are actually quite a few things that we can learn from this example application, and quite a few things that we can pick up from the structure of how we actually create this, from applying it to a global app namespace or an object, to the actual function itself, being able to pass an object as settings. So we're going to look at passing an object as a property to a function. And then we're going to look at checking if these settings are defined with a series of if statements, and then we'll look at actually counting down using an interval, clearing that interval as well, and we'll just be logging the results to the console as we go. So let's take a look at the actual syntax of this. I've already got the example in my console. So we've basically got this global app object which holds all of the functions and properties that we need for our application, our JavaScript application to function. And we've got this method here called countdown. This is basically just a function that allows a parameter to be passed into. Now you'll see here that we're passing one parameter. Don't confuse this as passing two parameters. We're passing one parameter to this function, and that parameter is an object in JavaScript. And what this is doing is it's allowing us to have several properties within this object that define the settings for this this to run. Now you might be wondering why we're even bothering passing an object in. We could just do something like this, so count down from 10 to 1 for example, but you'll notice that the way that we call this, it just doesn't look as good as if we were to use an object like this. This is so much more user friendly. Now you might also be thinking, why do I need to bother with user friendly parameters to a function? Well, at the end of the day, if you look at it like this, and this is only one benefit, if you look at it like this, you can see immediately what these properties do. The other benefit, of course, is that we can miss one of these out if we want and not cause too many problems, but also we can specify these in whichever order that we want. We don't actually need to specify these in this order, because at the end of the day, a property within an object is a property. We read it using start at and end at, so we use the dot notation start at, dot notation end at. So this is how we call it. I won't go into any more about how we call it this way now, but this is how it looks, and this is how you would call it within your code. Let's take a look at what it looks like when we run it. Now as soon as I run it, you'll see we get an undefined, grey undefined returned here, and what that basically means is that this method isn't actually returning anything. A method by default will automatically return undefined unless you explicitly define a return value. So a function will always return undefined in JavaScript. Now when we hit it, you can see the undefined's returned, and then we count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and eventually get to it just saying finished. At which point the interval is no longer running. So this is basically what our method is going to do. Now, although we're just logging to the console, you could see this can be beneficial as if we were doing something on the page. Obviously, at the moment, we're just learning how to write the code, so we're just outputting to the console. But when we start learning things like DOM exploration, so looking at working with DOM objects, then we can actually apply these numbers to our page itself. So, this is the sort of 90% of the work complete. And although we're only logging to the console, we can do a lot more with this. So let's go ahead and go over to our code and actually start writing this little application up. Okay, so we're over to our text editor, and there's absolutely no code whatsoever. We're going to be starting entirely from scratch here, basically within index.html, all we're doing is, as usual, just linking to this app.js file, which we're going to be working within here. So the first thing to do is really just define our app object that we're going to be using. Remember, we're using just this under one global namespace. We're not going to create any global variables except this app variable here, which is going to store our method for our countdown. And that just basically avoids us cluttering the global namespace with variables. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create a function and assign it to a countdown method within our app. So what I'm going to do is say app.countdown, so that's the name of the method that we're creating, and I'm going to go ahead and create the function that will define this and end that with a semicolon. Now we already know that we want to pass in settings to this, so we need to define that we want one parameter to be passed to this function, and then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to console log settings, so just so we can see how this works as we go. Okay, so now inside of the browser I'm going to go ahead and type app.countdown, and you can already see that sort of auto filling it for me. That's the code, we know what it looks like that. Let's go ahead and call it, and we get undefined. So we've not actually defined any settings as we speak. If I go ahead and enter an empty object into the parameter set within the method, you see that we just get object returned. We also get undefined returned. Remember, that's because I said that if you don't return something explicitly, it will already return undefined, or automatically return undefined. So if I do that, now we get an object console logged, and then we get one returned, and that's signified by this little arrow here. So we don't actually need to return anything from this function. You can if you want, but there's no real need to. So the next thing that we're going to do is look at what variables that we want to use within this method, and we're going to use these. We're going to put these at the top of the method. We're going to declare them all at the top of the method, and this is absolute best practice. We don't want to be declaring variables here and there as we need them. We want to sort of get a solid idea of which variables that we need before we actually assign values to them. So we can create these and not assign values to them. The first one's going to be the interval, because we know that we need an interval here to actually be able to count down from 10 to 1, or from whichever number to whichever number. So we create the interval there that's going to store the interval created by the setInterval function in JavaScript. And we're also going to go ahead and create a counter, and I'm going to assign that a value of 0, just so I know that it has a value, and if anything does go wrong, it's always got a 0 value. With interval, unfortunately, we don't get the luxury of assigning it a default sort of value, but we know this counter is going to be an integer, so we can just go ahead and set it. The next thing I'm going to do, and I am going to include commenting here just so we can get into the best practice of using commenting. I'm going to go ahead and define the start and the end points. And what that means is that means the start at, so that could be 10, and the end at, which could be 1, for example. So I'm going to go ahead and say start at equals 0 and end at equals 0 as well. So I've now got my comma separated list of variables that I need. I can go down and actually start checking whether my settings are available and then assigning them values. Now the first thing that we want to do here when we actually call our method is check that this settings value here is defined, or if it's not undefined. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an if statement here to say if settings equals undefined. Now remember, this is a strict comparison, and if this hasn't been specified, we will it will return undefined, as we've already seen within the console. And in this case, we want to then do something like alert the user as to the fact they haven't defined any of the settings that we need. So I'm just going to type please provide settings. Otherwise, let's just go ahead and console.log OK for now, just so that we can see for ourselves that this has worked. So I'm going to go ahead and provide this app.countdown method with no settings, and you see that we get the please provide settings output. If I go ahead and enter an object here, it says OK. Now that's all well and good, but we need to make sure that this settings object contains the start at and end at values that we're then going to assign to these variables here. So we're going to take the settings object and we're going to assign the value that we provided at the start at and end at, and we're going to assign them to our local variables within our method. So it's really just a case of nesting if statements. We don't want to get into the habit of nesting too many if statements. We are doing about 3 nests here, and there probably are other ways to do this, but we're just taking it easy and just making sure that we can understand the code as we go. So otherwise, we want to perform another check to say if settings.startAt is undefined, or settings.end at is undefined, we want to go ahead and console log and say the start and end number are required. So we're going to say settings.start at equals undefined. So if that's undefined, or, so we're using our or operator here, settings.end at equals undefined. Then we want to go ahead and console log and just say start and end values are required. Okay, so, or we could say number here, that might make a bit more sense. Okay, so otherwise, that's when we want to say console log OK. So this is the sort of OK point of our application here. So let's go ahead and check this out. So settings.start at is what's provided within the object, and settings.end at is what's provided within the object. And we saw this at the start of the video when we did something like this. So when I go ahead and do that, we get OK. But if I go ahead and provide an empty object, we get start and end number are required. So obviously this isn't actually needed. We don't need to do all these checks, but it gets sort of gets into the habit of checking if things are available before we start doing things, just so we don't get any unexpected errors. So what we're going to do now is, now that we know everything's fine, we've got the two values that we require, which are within the settings, we can go ahead and assign the settings.start at value to start at and end at, the same with end at here. So I'm going to say start at. Now notice we're not using var here because we're not actually declaring that we are creating a variable, we're just assigning a value to this variable that has already been created. So I'm going to say start at equals settings.start at. Now this isn't quite enough because remember we're trying to be as careful as we possibly can. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and parse it to an integer. So we use the parseInt function, which we've already looked at in this series, and I'm going to also define the radix as well. So which base we want this at, and that's base 10, which is obviously the decimal number system. So end at and end at. Now the reason I'm doing this is I linted this before I started recording, and it's told me off. So when we looked at JSLint with this code, it said we needed to provide this value, which is fair enough. It's a good thing to do. Okay, so now that we've got the start at and end at values, we've made sure that they're integers. We've parsed them to an integer. So if any wonky values have been defined, then they'll be picked up. What we now want to do is perform another quick check, and this is the last if statement. Well, it's not, it's the second to last if statement, but it's the last if statement to check things, I promise. We're going to want to check if these are both numbers. So in this case, we're just going to say if not is not a number, and then say start at. Now this might look a bit confusing, but basically what we want to do is check if both of these are actually numbers. So we could say if is not a number start at, or is nan end at. So we would then go ahead and console log an error. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just change the logic in this a little bit, and I'm just going to say if not is not a number. So if it is a number and this is a number. So we basically, in this if statement here, we're checking if both of these are numbers, so if they're valid numbers. If NaN's returned, this will mean that the start at and end at values have been provided as a string or something like that. If these are both satisfied, then we can go on and actually start to count down. We're not going to include an else here. We're just going to silently fail if these aren't a number, because we're going to assume that the developer using this method is intelligent enough to understand that we should be passing through an integer as a number that we want to count down as. But you can go ahead and change this to suit your needs if you like it. You know, it's entirely up to you how you handle these errors. So what we're now going to do is we created this counter variable up here a moment ago. So I'm going to say counter equals start at, and I'm separating these two because we're actually going to be incrementing the counter, and I don't want to increment the start at value. I want to always store the fact that I started at a particular point. I don't want to just increment the start at value because it just doesn't make sense. The variable name will not make sense. So now what I want to do is actually start the interval itself. So we've already declared the interval variable up here, so I can just go ahead and set it. So I'm going to say interval equals set interval using the set interval function. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a closure, and then I'm going to provide as the second parameter the time. And this is obviously every second, because we're going to assume that we're working in seconds, and we want to count down an integer downwards every second. Now within this closure, what I want to do is I want to check if the counter is at the end or not. Otherwise, I want to go ahead and log out the counter and then decrement the counter. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop a comment, is the counter at the end? And I'm going to go down and I'm going to say if, in fact, let's go ahead and just take this sort of one step at a time, I guess. The first thing that we want to do is say counter equals counter minus 1. So we want to decrement the counter for every loop of this interval. What we then want to do is above here, we want to console log out the counter. So let's just take a look at what happens here. I guess we haven't looked in here for a while. So the way that we're going to call this is app.countdown. We're going to provide a start at value, and that's going to be, I don't know, 5 for example, and then an end at value which ends at 1. So we want that to end at 1. Now we've got a little error here. You may have noticed that while I was typing, but I certainly didn't. So obviously we need a capital N there. That's not a recognized function. Let's go ahead and just call that again. So we get undefined, we get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, as we'd expect. So our countdown is actually working. But as you've probably noticed, we don't have an if statement to check if the counter's at the end or not. So this is just going to count down forever, basically. So let's go ahead and modify this. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to do an if statement and an else. So if the counter is less than end at, so if it's less than on the last increment, less than the number that we provide, so if it's less than 1, i.e. is it 0, then we want to go ahead and stop everything. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and console log out the number, and we could even place this counter here within this else as well. I'm just going to keep it outside for now, just for the sake of it. So if the counter is at the end, what do we want to do? Well, I'm going to go ahead and console log finished, and then I'm going to go ahead and clear the interval, which is interval. So now what's going to happen is when it reaches 1, so if the counter, i.e. the number that we're decrementing, reaches under the number that we provided in end at settings, then we want to console log finish and clear the interval. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and carry on outputting the counter number. So now what will happen is it will actually get to 1, and then after that second it will say finished, and then the interval has been cleared. So we now know the interval is no longer active. This is it really. I mean, the functionality of this application is complete. It is fairly straightforward, but the one thing I do want to do is go ahead and set the counter back to 0. I want to set start at back to 0, and I want to put end at back to 0 as well. You don't need to do this, but it's just sort of resetting all of the variables that we created up here. We've already cleared the interval, so we're all good in that sense. So this code has allowed us to create a short method within our app object and allow us to provide a start at and an end at value to count down from a number to a specific number. We can call this within our console here and see that this is working, but equally what we could do is we could go ahead and define it in our code as well. So we could go ahead, for example, in here and say something like script, and we could say app.countdown start at 3, end at 1, and then we could go ahead and run this, and that will automatically run our code 3, 2, 1, and then say finished. So we have a fully working countdown application.